Don't speak tonight, Ethan. Please. I don't want my family thinking this dinner is awkward because of you. Claire said it while fixing my tie in the reflection of the passenger window, like she was adjusting something temporary, something decorative, the kind of thing you straighten before guests arrive. Her fingers brushed the knot once, smooth and cold. Then she stepped back in her black heels and emerald coat, while the lights from her parents' estate glowed across the wet driveway behind her. For a second, I just stared at her. 10 years of marriage, and somehow 4 words managed to make me feel smaller than silence itself. Don't speak tonight. Not don't argue. Not don't embarrass me. Just don't speak. Like my voice itself had become the problem. I smiled anyway. Funny how men do that sometimes. We smile when something cracks because it's easier than letting people hear the sound break open. Got it, I said quietly. Claire nodded like I'd finally learned a lesson she'd been trying to teach for years. Then she walked ahead of me toward the front doors of the Bennett house without waiting to see if I followed. The cold November wind rolled across the driveway, carrying the smell of rain and cedar mulch. Somewhere near the front fountain, water splashed softly beneath white landscape lights. Everything about the place screamed old money. Not loud money. Worse. The kind that never has to prove it exists. Her father's house sat on 12 acres outside Greenwich, Connecticut, hidden behind iron gates and maple trees older than most marriages. I remember the first time Claire brought me there. Back then, she held my hand when we walked inside. Back then, she introduced me with pride in her voice. "This is Ethan," she'd said at 26 years old with her eyes shining. "He's brilliant." Funny how success changes the definition of brilliant. Now, I was just quiet. Just Ethan. The valet opened the front doors before we reached them, and warm air wrapped around us, carrying the smell of rosemary, wine, and expensive candles. Voices drifted from the dining room. Laughter. Crystal glasses touching. Her younger brother, Tyler, was already talking loudly about crypto or startups or some other thing rich people pretend is a personality. Claire slipped into that world effortlessly the second she crossed the marble floor. Her smile changed, sharper, polished, corporate. "Claire," her mother called from near the staircase. Diane Bennett wore cream silk and diamonds like they'd been sewn into her skin at birth. She kissed Claire's cheek, then looked at me with the same expression people give hotel furniture. Pleasant. Forgettable. "Ethan," she said politely. "Good to see you." "You too." Claire shot me a quick look the second I answered. Tiny, fast. But I caught it. Too many words already. I loosened my jaw and slipped my hands into my coat pockets while servers moved around us carrying silver trays of champagne. The dining room looked like something out of a magazine spread. Long walnut table. Gold candlelight reflecting against polished glass. White roses arranged perfectly down the center. Richard Bennett sat at the far end in a charcoal suit with reading glasses low on his nose, while Tyler leaned beside him talking too loudly about venture capital. Nobody noticed when I entered, or maybe they did and simply didn't care. Same result either way. Claire touched my wrist lightly before sitting down. "Just stay relaxed tonight, okay?" she whispered. "Dad's investors are here." Investors. Right. That explained the extra wine bottles and the fake laughter bouncing off the walls. I took my seat halfway down the table while conversations moved around me like water around a rock. Nobody asked me anything. Nobody needed to. Tyler was already telling a story about Miami. Claire laughed at exactly the right moments beside him, wineglass balanced elegantly between her fingers. Every now and then she rested her hand on my arm for appearances, but it felt rehearsed, like a politician kissing babies during campaign season. "So, Tyler's company is expanding into Austin now," Diane announced proudly. "Third office in 18 months. Fourth," Tyler corrected with a grin. "We closed Dallas last week." A few people applauded softly. Claire looked impressed. "That's incredible," she said. Then one of the investors glanced toward me politely. "And what about you, Ethan?" Before I could answer, Claire laughed lightly and reached for her wine. "Oh, Ethan keeps busy," she said. "He's more low-key these days." These days. I looked down at the untouched water beside my plate, while heat settled quietly into my chest. Not anger. Something colder. Is when you realize someone has slowly edited you out of your own life, one conversation at a time. Across the table, Tyler smirked. "Must be nice, honestly," he said. "No stress, no board meetings, no investors breathing down your neck." A few people chuckled. Claire did too. And somehow that hurt more than the joke itself. I leaned back slightly in my chair and listened to the laughter drift across the candlelight, while silverware clinked softly against china. Outside, rain tapped against the tall dining room windows. Inside, I sat silently beside my wife, while she pretended I was smaller than the room around us. And the worst part was, for the first time in years, I think I started believing her. Dinner moved the way expensive dinners always do, slow enough for people to feel important while servants quietly kept the glasses full. Candles flickered against crystal decanters. Rain slid down the tall windows in silver lines. Somewhere in the house, an old jazz record played softly through hidden speakers, the kind of music people with inherited money use to convince themselves they are timeless. I sat halfway down the table, listening to conversations rise and fall around me, while waiters replaced plates almost before anyone finished eating. Nobody asked what I thought about anything. Politics, artificial intelligence. The room moved on without me, like I was part of the wallpaper. Claire seemed comfortable with that. More than comfortable. Relieved. Every time attention drifted toward me, she redirected it somewhere safer. Toward Tyler. Toward herself. Toward Richard's investors seated near the far end of the table. I noticed the pattern because once you spend enough years being quietly erased, you start recognizing the rhythm of it. "The Greenwich property market is going insane," one of the guests said while cutting into a filet mignon that probably cost more than my first apartment rent. "People are paying 30% above asking price." Tyler laughed confidently. "That is because old money is terrified of becoming normal." A few people chuckled at that. Claire smiled proudly at her brother like he had invented wisdom itself. Then Tyler glanced at me with that same grin he always wore around me. Casual, harmless, sharp underneath if you looked close enough. "Ethan probably does not even notice inflation anymore," he joked. "Hard to spend money when your biggest hobby is staying home." More laughter. Softer this time. The polite kind. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, while Claire leaned slightly toward one of the investors beside her. "Ethan likes simpler things," she said. "Honestly, he avoids attention whenever possible." Avoids attention. Funny way to describe being dismissed for years by the person sleeping beside you. But I nodded anyway, because correcting her would only prove her point somehow. That is the trick with these situations. Once people decide who you are, defending yourself starts sounding like guilt. The waiter placed another course in front of me. Sea bass over risotto, with lemon butter filling the air between conversations. I barely tasted it. Across the table, Claire tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear while laughing at something one of the guests whispered. She looked beautiful and controlled. elegant, untouchable. The same woman who used to eat burgers with me on the hood of my old truck outside New Haven when we were broke and 24. Back then, she used to beg me to talk about my ideas, my plans, my work. She used to look at me like my words mattered. Somewhere along the way, success changed the temperature of our marriage. Not all at once. Slow. Like heat leaving a room 1 degree at a time, until suddenly you notice you've been cold for years.
"So, Claire tells us you work from home now,"
another guest said politely, finally acknowledging my existence. Before I answered, Tyler smirked over his wineglass.
Translation, he said, he escaped the corporate world before it could expose him. More laughter rolled across the table. Claire laughed too, though quieter this time. Still enough. Always enough. I smiled faintly and looked down at the reflection of chandelier light in my water glass. The funny thing was, Tyler would have begged for a meeting with me 6 years ago. Half the people at this table would have. But anonymity changes how people measure respect. If your name is not in magazines anymore, they assume your story ended. Richard Bennett stayed mostly silent through dinner, which was unusual for him. Claire's father had the kind of presence that never needed volume. Silver hair, navy suit tailored perfectly, calm eyes that missed nothing. He sat at the head of the table, listening more than speaking, while people competed for his approval without realizing how obvious it looked. Every now and then I caught him glancing toward me, not judgmental, curious, like he was trying to solve something that did not fit. Tyler launched into another story about his latest expansion deal in Austin, talking fast now, feeding off attention. "We're expecting another $20 million in valuation by spring," he said proudly, assuming the acquisition closes. Richard finally looked up from his wine. "Who is advising the acquisition?" Tyler shrugged confidently. "Still deciding. We have interest from several firms." I noticed immediately he was bluffing. The numbers he quoted earlier did not match the current debt environment, not even close. Anyone experienced enough would hear the holes instantly. But nobody challenged him because confidence sounds like intelligence to people who only understand surfaces. Tyler kept talking. Claire watched him admiringly, and for the first time all night, I saw Richard Bennett's eyes drift slowly toward me across the candlelight, like he already knew I had noticed something everyone else missed. The conversation kept flowing around the table, smooth and polished like expensive whiskey poured over ice. But underneath it, I could feel something shifting. Richard Bennett had gone quieter. Men like him did not waste silence. They used it. Tyler kept talking anyway, too confident to notice the room changing temperature around him. "The Austin deal is basically done," he said while cutting into his steak. "Once we secure the final capital partner, the valuation doubles overnight." One of the investors raised an eyebrow politely. "That aggressive?" Tyler grinned. "You have to think aggressively now. Safe money is dead money." Claire nodded beside him, like she had heard brilliance. "Tyler has incredible instincts," she added. "He sees trends before everyone else." I looked down at my plate for a second, because I suddenly remembered another dinner almost 8 years earlier. Small restaurant in Manhattan. Brick walls, cheap wine. Claire sitting across from me holding both my hands, on asking questions about market timing and private equity structures, because she genuinely wanted to understand my world back then. I remember how bright her eyes looked when I explained things to her. She used to say she loved how calm I stayed under pressure, loved how I could walk into chaos without raising my voice. Funny how the same qualities become disappointing once people stop associating them with power. Tyler continued speaking. "Honestly, most firms are behind right now.
They still evaluate growth like it is 2015. I felt it immediately. The flaw in the sentence, small, but enough. Richard heard it too. I could tell by the way his fingers stopped moving against the stem of his wine glass. Tyler was throwing around valuation language without understanding current debt pressure. The kind of mistake inexperienced founders make when they spend more time pitching success than building it. Still, nobody corrected him. Wealthy rooms are strange that way. Confidence gets mistaken for competence all the time. "And your debt exposure?" Richard asked calmly. Tyler waved a hand dismissively. "Minimal." Another mistake. Too fast. Too clean. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair. "In this market?" Tyler hesitated for half a second, barely noticeable, but I saw it. Claire did not. She jumped in immediately to rescue him. "Tyler has amazing advisors," she said quickly. "Some of the best people in New York." Richard nodded once, but his eyes drifted toward me again. Not long, just enough. Then one of the guests turned toward me suddenly, like they had remembered I existed. "What do you think, Ethan?" Claire answered before I could open my mouth. "Trust me, Ethan hates business conversations at dinner." Her tone stayed light, playful, but something about it landed harder this time. Maybe because it was not true. I did not hate business conversations. I hated being managed like a liability in my own marriage. A soft laugh moved around the table again. Tyler smirked into his bourbon. "Honestly, I respect it," he said. "No stress, no pressure." "Sounds peaceful." Peaceful. I almost smiled at that. There was nothing peaceful about slowly disappearing inside your own life. The waiter refilled wine glasses while rain continued tapping softly against the windows behind us. Candlelight flickered across silverware and crystal. Somewhere near the kitchen, dishes clinked faintly. Everything looked warm, elegant, normal. But underneath it, I felt old memories surfacing, whether I wanted them or not. 46 floors above Park Avenue, private boardrooms with glass walls. Men twice my age waiting for my decision before moving billions of dollars. My name printed on financial magazines I used to throw away without reading. I walked away from all of it 6 years ago, after my younger brother died in a car accident outside Boston. One phone call. One rainy highway. One moment that split my life clean down the center. After that, money started feeling weightless, pointless even. So I stepped back, quietly, sold visibility before it could consume what was left of me. Most people thought I disappeared. I let them. Claire understood in the beginning, at least I thought she did. But grief changes shape over time. Mine became silence. Hers became resentment. "You still consulting at all?" one of the investors asked politely. Claire reached for her wine again. "A little," she answered smoothly. "Mostly small things now." Small things. The words settled into my chest heavier than they should have. Across the table, Richard finally set his glass down carefully against the white linen tablecloth. "That is interesting," he said quietly. The room softened around his voice almost immediately, because everyone there understood one thing. When Richard Bennett decided to speak, people listened. He looked directly at me for the first time all night. Because men who understand capital structures the way you just reacted to Tyler usually do not spend their lives handling small things. The entire table went still. For a second, nobody spoke. The rain outside suddenly sounded louder against the windows, soft and steady beneath the silence sitting over the table. Tyler shifted slightly in his chair. Claire's smile tightened almost invisibly beside me. Richard Bennett kept his eyes on mine, calm and unreadable, like a man waiting to see whether someone would lie to him. I could feel the attention moving now, not toward Claire, not toward Tyler, toward me. Funny how quickly rooms change once silence becomes interesting. I set my water glass down carefully against the tablecloth. "You pick up a few things over time," I said quietly. Tyler laughed too fast. "See? That is exactly what I mean about Ethan, mysterious man." A few people smiled politely, grateful for the tension break. Claire reached for her wine again, but did not drink it. I noticed her fingers this time, slightly tense around the stem. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair. "No," he said. "That was not luck." The room went still again. Most people at this table would not have noticed the flaw in Tyler's projections. Tyler's jaw flexed faintly. "There is no flaw." Richard did not even look at him. "You are over-leveraged in a tightening market," he said calmly. And Ethan reacted before anyone else at this table processed the numbers. Tyler opened his mouth, then stopped. The investors suddenly looked much more interested in their wine glasses. Claire gave a small, nervous laugh. "Dad, you are reading too much into this." But Richard still looked at me. "Am I?" I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, before looking down at the candlelight flickering across the table. There was a time when moments like this used to excite me. Rooms tightening, numbers moving, people waiting for me to speak before making million-dollar decisions. I used to live inside pressure the way some men live inside religion. Every morning began with market reports and ended with negotiations under glass ceilings overlooking Manhattan. 46th floor. Walker Capital Management. The company my brother and I built from a borrowed office with second-hand furniture and a coffee maker that leaked across the counter every morning. Back then, nobody cared how quiet I was because silence attached to money becomes wisdom. Funny how that works. I remembered nights sleeping in the office while my brother Noah covered spreadsheets beside me, eating cold pizza at 2 a.m. We were not trying to become powerful. We were just trying to survive long enough to matter. 10 years later, our firm managed billions in assets across 3 countries. Financial magazines called us disciplined, ruthless, visionary. They used words like calculated masculinity and strategic restraint because rich people love turning emotionally damaged men into magazine profiles. Noah used to laugh at that stuff. "They make us sound cooler than we are," he told me once while standing on the balcony outside our Manhattan office. Wind whipping between skyscrapers. We are just 2 exhausted guys, pretending not to panic. Then one rainy night outside Boston, his car slid across black ice, and everything we built stopped meaning what it used to. Grief does strange things to ambition. It strips the shine off success until all that remains is weight. After Noah died, I stopped caring about visibility. I stepped away from interviews first, then conferences, then public ownership positions, quietly, methodically. Walker Capital still existed. The money still moved. The investments still happened. I simply removed myself from the center of the photograph. Most people assumed I burned out. Others assumed I failed. Leave both because correcting strangers takes energy grief no longer leaves you with. Claire understood in the beginning. At least, I thought she did. She held me through the funeral, sat beside me during sleepless nights, told me peace mattered more than money. But over time, peace started looking too much like weakness to her. The quieter I became, the more embarrassed she seemed by my absence from the world she respected. Promotions excited her. Visibility excited her. Prestige dinners like this excited her. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being the man she admired and became the man she explained away. Ethan just likes staying out of things. Ethan is low-key now.
Ethan keeps busy. Little phrases, tiny reductions. Death by 1,000 polite summaries. So, what exactly do you do these days? One of the investors finally asked carefully. Before I answered, Claire smiled quickly. Consulting, mostly. The words landed softly between us. Consulting, mostly. I almost nodded along with her, almost let the moment pass like all the others before it. But then Richard Bennett leaned forward slightly beneath the chandelier light, studying me with the kind of attention powerful men reserve for puzzles they are close to solving. Interesting, he said quietly. Because I have only met one person who used the phrase over-leveraged exposure exactly the way you just did. He paused. And 6 years ago, that man ran one of the most feared firms on the East Coast. Claire slowly turned toward me beside the candlelight. And for the first time all night, I watched uncertainty enter my wife's face. The room did not explode the way people imagine moments like that do. No dramatic gasps, no dropped wine glasses. Real shock is quieter. It moves slowly across faces, while people recalculate the person sitting in front of them. Candlelight flickered against crystal and silver, while nobody at the table seemed completely sure what expression they were supposed to wear anymore. Claire stared at me beside the glow of the chandelier, her fingers still wrapped around her untouched wine glass. "Dad," she said carefully, forcing a small laugh, "you are talking like Ethan is some secret billionaire." Richard never looked away from me. "Am I wrong?" he asked. I could feel every set of eyes at the table now. Investors, family friends. Tyler sitting straighter than before, suddenly less comfortable inside his own confidence. Funny how quickly arrogance changes shape once uncertainty enters the room. I leaned back slightly in my chair and folded my hands together beneath the table. "Walker Capital was a long time ago," I said quietly. Tyler blinked first. "Wait," laughed once, short and confused. "Walker Capital as in Walker Capital Management?" Nobody answered him immediately. Richard did. "The same Walker Capital that acquired Northbridge Holdings before the 2018 collapse," he said calmly. "The same Walker Capital that exited commercial debt 6 months before the market correction." One of the investors across the table actually sat forward now. "That was your firm?" he asked me carefully. Claire looked between us, confusion slowly cracking through her polished expression. "Ethan," she said quietly, "what is he talking about?" I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny. Strange the question sounded coming from my wife. What is he talking about? Like she had spent so many years shrinking me into something manageable that the possibility of a larger truth now felt impossible to process. "It was before I stepped away," I said simply. Tyler stared at me like he was trying to pull together puzzle pieces that suddenly refused to fit. "No," he said slowly. "That cannot be right." Richard finally looked toward his son. "You remember the conference in Boston when you were 22? Tyler frowned. "The hedge fund summit? You spent 3 days trying to get a meeting with Ethan Walker." Silence. Complete silence. Tyler's face changed first, then Claire's. I watched realization move through her slowly, painfully, like someone turning lights on one room at a time inside a house she thought she knew. "That was you?" she asked softly. I looked down at the tablecloth for a second before answering. "Yes." The rain outside kept falling steadily against the tall windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, a tray rattled faintly before going quiet again. Nobody at the table touched their food anymore. I remembered the conference Richard mentioned. Boston Harbor Hotel, Navy suit, security detail outside the ballroom because too many investors wanted meetings at once. Back then, Tyler was just another ambitious kid chasing venture capital introductions.
I vaguely remembered shaking his hand for maybe 30 seconds between meetings. Neither of us knew then that one day he would spend years mocking me across family dinners while asking people like me for funding behind closed doors. Life has a cruel sense of humor sometimes. Claire leaned back slowly in her chair beside me. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked. Her voice had lost all its polished confidence now. I turned toward her fully for the first time all night. "I did tell you." She frowned slightly. "No, you did not. I told you 6 years ago why I left New York." Her expression tightened. That is not the same thing. Maybe she believed that, maybe not. Than either of us wanted to admit. I had stopped talking about my old life because every time I did, it felt like reopening a room grief had already emptied. Walker Capital was never just a company to me. It was Noah's laugh during late nights, coffee stains on contracts, airport terminals at midnight, hospital hallways after the funeral where success suddenly felt small enough to fit in a pocket. After he died, I did not want recognition anymore. I wanted quiet. But quiet disappoints people addicted to status, especially people who build their identities around visibility. "Jesus Christ," one of the investors whispered softly. Tyler laughed once under his breath, but this time there was no arrogance in it, only embarrassment. "You let us sit here talking to you like—" He stopped himself. "Like you were nothing." He did not finish the sentence because he did not need to. Claire's eyes stayed fixed on me now, searching my face like she was meeting someone unfamiliar. And maybe she was. The terrible thing about relationships is that sometimes people stop seeing you long before they stop loving the idea of you. Richard Bennett picked up his wine glass calmly, studying me over the rim. "You disappeared very effectively," he said. I nodded once. That was the point. Then Claire asked the question that finally revealed everything wrong between us. Not where I had been. Not whether I was okay after Noah died. Not why I chose silence. She looked at me with uncertainty, trembling quietly beneath her voice, and asked, "Do you have any idea how different tonight would have been if people here knew who you were?" And sitting there beside my wife, under the soft chandelier light, I realized that was exactly the problem. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Claire asked that question. The candles burned low across the center of the table, their reflections trembling softly in half-finished wine glasses, while rain continued sliding down the dark windows behind us. Richard Bennett studied his daughter quietly. Tyler stared at me like he was trying to understand how many jokes he had accidentally told the wrong man over the years. And Claire kept looking at me with that same unsettled expression, like the ground beneath her marriage had shifted an inch without warning. Different tonight. The words stayed in my head longer than they should have, not because they surprised me, because they confirmed something I think I had known for a long time, but never wanted to say out loud. Claire did not miss me. She missed the version of me other people respected. "Claire," Diane said carefully from the other end of the table, "I do not think that is what he meant." But Claire barely heard her. Her eyes never left mine. "Why would you hide something like that from me?" she asked softly. Hide. Another interesting word. People always call it hiding when a man stops performing value for an audience. I sat quietly for a second before answering. I did not hide it. Ethan, her voice tightened slightly now. You never once told my family who you were. You asked me not to talk tonight. The sentence landed gently, calmly, but the entire table felt it anyway. Claire blinked first. Tyler looked down into his bourbon glass immediately after. Richard leaned back in his chair with the smallest expression of recognition crossing his face. Not satisfaction. Understanding. The kind older men get when they finally see the shape of a marriage more clearly than the people inside it do. Claire swallowed hard. That is not fair. Is it not? I asked quietly. Another silence, heavier this time. The kind silence that arrives when truth enters a room wearing ordinary clothes. Claire set her wine glass down too quickly against the tablecloth. I just did not want tonight turning awkward. I nodded once. And me speaking would have done that? You know what I mean. No, I said calmly. I do not think I do anymore. The investors at the table suddenly became very interested in their food again. Nobody wanted to be trapped inside a married couple's fracture line, but fractures do not care who is watching when they split open. Claire looked away first, toward the rain-dark windows beside the dining room. You disappeared from your old life, she said quietly. You stopped wanting anything. That one almost hurt because part of it was true. After Noah died, ambition started feeling loud in all the wrong ways. The city felt louder, meetings felt louder, even money sounded louder somehow. I stopped chasing growth because grief changes your relationship with importance. Suddenly, billion-dollar deals feel strangely weightless when someone you love no longer exists to call afterward. But I had not stopped wanting things. I still wanted peace, still wanted loyalty, still wanted a marriage where silence did not make me invisible. I stopped wanting attention, I said carefully. That is different. Claire laughed softly under her breath, but there was no humor in it. Easy to say when you already had everything. Richard finally spoke again. Careful, just one word, calm, controlled. But Claire straightened slightly anyway. Her father rarely raised his voice because he never needed to. Dad, come on. No. Richard folded his napkin slowly beside his plate. You spent the entire evening treating your husband like an inconvenience. Claire's face flushed immediately. That is not true. Tyler shifted uncomfortably beside her. Diane looked down at the table. Nobody defended Claire because nobody honestly could. Richard turned toward me then. You know, he said thoughtfully, I met your brother once. The words caught me off guard harder than they should have. Noah? Richard nodded. Charity event in Manhattan. He talked about you for 20 straight minutes. For a second, the room disappeared. I could almost hear Noah laughing again. Boston accent softened by years in New York. Always louder than me. Always warmer. He used to introduce me at events like I was the smartest man alive. My brother sees things before markets do, he would tell people proudly. I just convince investors not to panic while he figures everything out. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Grief is strange that way. It waits quietly in corners for years, then suddenly sits down beside you at dinner. Richard looked at me carefully across the candlelight. He seemed proud of you. I nodded once because I did not trust my voice immediately. Claire watched the exchange silently now. The room had completely changed. Earlier I had been decoration. A background husband people talked around. Now every person sitting there was recalculating me in real time. But the strange part was this. None of it actually felt good. Respect that only arrives after status is revealed always feels borrowed somehow, temporary, hollow around the edges. Claire looked at me again finally, softer this time. "Why did you never tell me how much this still hurt you?" she asked quietly. I stared at the candle flame flickering between us before answering. "Because every time I tried," I said, "you looked more disappointed in me than concerned." And across the table, Richard Bennett slowly closed his eyes like a man finally understanding exactly how long I had been sitting silently inside this marriage. The dinner never really recovered after that. Conversations restarted eventually, but they moved differently now. Slower, careful around the edges. Like everyone at the table suddenly understood there had been another version of the night hiding underneath the first one. The investors stopped talking to Tyler like he was the smartest man in the room. Diane became unusually quiet. Even the waitstaff seemed more cautious while clearing plates and refilling glasses beneath the low chandelier light. Claire barely touched her wine anymore. She sat beside me, staring down at the tablecloth, like she was replaying every conversation we had shared over the last 6 years, and realizing she might have missed entire chapters. Richard Bennett remained calm through all of it, but I could feel his attention shifting toward me more openly now. Not because of money. Not entirely. Men like Richard respected restraint more than wealth. And tonight he had watched an entire room underestimate someone who never once tried correcting them. That mattered to him. "So, what are you doing these days exactly?" one of the investors finally asked again, more respectfully this time. I gave the same answer I always did. Mostly private work. Uneasy laugh. "Private work," he repeated. "That sounds a lot different now." Nobody laughed with him this time. Claire looked embarrassed immediately after he spoke. Not for me, for him. Funny how fast standards change once status enters the room. Richard folded his hands together slowly. "Walker Capital still exists, does it not?" I nodded once. "Different structure now, but still active, yes." One of the investors nearly choked on his drink. "You are telling me you still control Walker Capital?" "Partially." Another silence settled over the table, heavier than before. I could almost hear people mentally recalculating every moment from earlier that evening. Every joke. Every dismissive smile. Every time Claire redirected attention away from me, like she was embarrassed by the possibility of me speaking too long. Claire finally turned toward me fully. "Why would you live like this?" she asked softly. I frowned slightly. "Like what?" "Small." That word sat between us longer than anything else she had said all night. Small. Not peaceful. Not private. Small. Richard closed his eyes briefly at the far end of the table, like a man hearing something he wished his daughter had not revealed out loud. I looked at Claire carefully then. Really looked at her. The woman I married at 28. The woman who once sat beside me on apartment floors, eating takeout, because neither of us could afford furniture yet. The woman who used to laugh when I forgot expensive dinners, because she claimed none of that stuff mattered. Somewhere along the line, she stopped measuring life by closeness and started measuring it by visibility. And maybe that shift had happened so slowly, neither of us noticed until tonight. "You think quiet means small," I said calmly. Claire shook her head immediately. "That is not what I meant." But it was. We both knew it. Tyler cleared his throat awkwardly beside her. "Honestly, this is insane." He looked at me directly now, no arrogance left in his voice. Do you know how many people would kill for your position?
Tyler.
Diane warned softly. I mean professionally, he corrected quickly. I almost smiled. That position cost more than you think. Richard nodded faintly at that. He understood. Men who spend their lives building things usually do. The room drifted quieter again, while servers cleared the final plates. Rain still tapped steadily against the windows, soft beneath the low jazz music floating through the house. Outside, the estate grounds disappeared into darkness beyond the glass. Inside, everything suddenly felt too warm, too bright. Claire reached for my hand under the table unexpectedly. Her fingers trembled slightly against mine.
Ethan,
she said quietly.
I did not know you felt this way.
I looked down at her hand resting against mine. Beautiful manicure. Wedding ring catching candlelight. Familiar and distant all at once. You never asked. That one hurt her. I saw it immediately. Her eyes lowered for a second before she pulled her hand back slowly. Richard watched the exchange in silence. Then finally he stood from the table, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket carefully. Everyone else straightened automatically when he moved. Gentlemen, he said to the investors, why do not we continue this conversation in the library? They followed him almost immediately, eager now for proximity to the new gravity in the room. Tyler hesitated before standing too. Ethan, he said awkwardly, for what it is worth, I did not know. I know, I answered quietly. He nodded once and walked away. That left only Claire and me sitting beneath the chandelier, while the house grew quieter around us. She stared down at the empty wine glass in front of her for several long seconds, before finally whispering something so soft, I almost missed it. I think I have spent years talking around you instead of talking to you. I looked at her carefully then, because for the first time all night, she sounded less like a polished executive and more like the woman I married before success started teaching her what people were supposedly worth. But sometimes realization arrives too late to save what pride slowly starved over time. And sitting there across from my wife in the fading candlelight, I was no longer sure whether she missed me or simply missed the version of me the world admired. Claire and I stayed alone in the dining room long after everyone else moved into the library. The sound of distant conversation drifted faintly through the hallway, along with the soft clink of crystal glasses and low male laughter. Somewhere deeper in the house, a grandfather clock chimed 10 times. The rain outside had slowed now, turning into a soft mist against the dark windows surrounding the estate. Candlelight flickered lower across the table between us, throwing shadows against white linen and empty plates. Claire looked exhausted suddenly. Not physically, emotionally. Like she had spent years building a version of reality that no longer held together under direct light. She stared at me for several quiet seconds before speaking again. "Why did you stay with me?" she asked softly. The question caught me off guard more than everything else tonight. I leaned back slightly in my chair, listening to the faint jazz music still floating through hidden speakers somewhere above us. "What do you mean?" She swallowed once before answering. "If you knew I was becoming this person." This person. I noticed she did not say cruel or ashamed or dismissive. Just this person. Like even now she could not fully bring herself to name what had slowly happened between us. I looked down at the folded napkin beside my plate, because I kept thinking the woman I married was still somewhere underneath all of it. Claire's eyes lowered immediately. That hurt her more than anger would have. "Ethan, you used to laugh at stupid things," I said quietly. You used to sit on the kitchen counter while I cooked pasta at midnight in that tiny apartment in New Haven because we could not afford real furniture yet. You used to tell me peace mattered more than status. Her face tightened slowly. People change.
Yes, I said. They do. Another silence settled between us. Softer now, sadder. The kind that arrives after two people finally stop pretending the damage is temporary. Claire looked toward the dark hallway leading to the library where her father and the investors were still talking. "Do you know what tonight looked like to everyone in that room?" she asked quietly. "It looked like I spent years disrespecting a man more accomplished than anyone at this table." I almost smiled at the irony. "That is what bothers you?" Her eyes snapped back toward me. "No. But yes, at least partly." We both knew it. Claire stood suddenly from the table and walked toward the nearest window, arms folded tightly against herself, while staring out at the rain-covered lawn beyond the glass. "You think I only care now because of your money." I stayed seated. I think people reveal themselves when they believe there is nothing to gain from treating someone well. She closed her eyes briefly. "That is not fair." Neither was tonight. The words came out calm, controlled, but they landed anyway. Claire pressed one hand lightly against the cold window glass. "I was embarrassed," she admitted quietly. The honesty of it almost hurt more than the insults earlier. "Of me?" She hesitated too long. "Of the life we had become." I said slowly because that answer felt closer to truth than anything else she had said tonight. "You stopped seeing me as a man," I said quietly. "You started seeing me as potential that disappointed you." Claire turned toward me immediately. "That is not true." "Then why did you ask me not to speak?" Her mouth opened slightly, but no answer came. Just silence. The dangerous kind. The kind that confirms things words cannot survive. Footsteps echoed faintly from the hallway then. Richard Bennett appeared near the dining room entrance, jacket unbuttoned now, expression thoughtful beneath the low lighting. He looked between both of us once and understood the atmosphere immediately. Men his age usually do. "The investors are leaving," he said calmly. Claire straightened quickly, wiping beneath one eye before anyone could notice emotion settling there. Richard's gaze shifted toward me. "Walk with me for a minute?" I nodded once and stood from the table. Claire watched silently as I followed her father through the long hallway, lined with old family photographs and oil paintings. The library smelled like leather, cedarwood, and old books. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows, overlooking the back lawn, while Richard poured 2 fingers of bourbon into crystal glasses near the fireplace. He handed one to me. "Thank you," I said quietly. Richard studied the amber liquid in his own glass before speaking. "You know," he said, "most men in your position would have made a spectacle out of tonight." I looked into the fireplace flames for a second. What would be the point? Richard nodded faintly. Exactly. Another silence passed comfortably this time, different from the ones at dinner. Honest. "Claire has spent too much time around people who confuse visibility with worth," he said carefully. "That environment changes people." I stared at the firelight reflecting across the glass in my hand. "I know." Richard looked at me then, serious now. "But that does not excuse the way she treated you." The words landed heavier than I expected, not because I needed validation from her father, because it was the first time someone besides me had finally said it out loud. Richard took a slow sip of bourbon before continuing.
You should know something else. I glanced toward him. Tyler's Austin deal. He paused. Walker Capital was the firm that rejected it 8 months ago, was it not? I met his eyes calmly over the firelight. And after a long second, I nodded once. Richard Bennett did not look surprised when I nodded. He just stared into the fire for a few seconds, slow and thoughtful, like a man finally connecting pieces that had been scattered across years of quiet observations. The bourbon glass rested heavy in my hand while flames moved softly behind the iron grate, casting orange light across the library walls lined with old leather books and framed photographs. Tyler never mentioned Walker Capital passed on the deal, Richard said calmly. He probably did not know it was us, I answered. Richard let out the faintest breath through his nose. That might be worse. Somewhere deeper in the house, I heard a front door close, followed by muffled voices as the investors finally left the estate. The night had become quieter now, honest somehow, like all the performance had finally exhausted itself. Richard turned toward me again. You rejected the acquisition because of the debt structure. Partly. And the rest? I looked into the bourbon for a second before answering. Tyler built projections around attention instead of stability. Richard nodded slowly. No anger, no defensiveness. Just truth landing where truth usually lands hardest, inside fathers. He has always chased visibility, he admitted quietly. Claire, too, if I am being honest. I said nothing, because there was nothing useful left to add. Richard studied me carefully then. You still love her? It was not a question. I stared into the firelight while the answer settled somewhere heavy in my chest. I loved who she used to be. Richard looked down at his glass briefly after that. Sometimes people lose themselves slowly, he said. Success can become a mirror they stare into too long. I almost smiled at that because it sounded exactly like something a man says after watching wealth distort his family in real time for decades. Maybe, I said quietly. But eventually it becomes a choice. Another silence passed between us, comfortable, tired. The kind older men understand without needing to fill it. Then footsteps echoed softly down the hallway outside the library. Claire appeared near the doorway a moment later, arms folded lightly against herself beneath the soft golden light spilling from the hall. Makeup still looked perfect, but her eyes did not. Richard glanced between us once before setting his bourbon down carefully beside the fireplace. I think you two should talk. He walked past Claire without another word, placing one hand briefly on her shoulder as he disappeared into the hallway. Then it was just us again. Claire stepped slowly into the library, closing the door quietly behind her, while rain whispered faintly against the tall windows overlooking the dark lawn outside. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled softly between us. Dad told me about Tyler's deal, she said finally. I nodded once. You could have embarrassed him tonight. That was never the goal. Claire stared at me for a long moment, like she was trying to understand how someone could sit through humiliation without needing revenge afterward. Most people would have destroyed him after the way we treated you. We, not they. We. At least now she was finally saying it honestly. I looked toward the fire again. I did not want to destroy anyone. Claire's voice grew quieter. Then why did this feel so painful? That answer came easier than I expected. Because I realized you only wanted my silence when you thought I was small. The words settled into the room gently. No anger, no raised voice. Somehow, that made them hurt more. Claire looked away immediately, blinking hard once before folding her arms tighter around herself. That is not fair. It is true. Her eyes met mine again, glassy now beneath the firelight. I was frustrated, Ethan. With me? With us. I nodded slowly because at least that part was honest. You stopped fighting for anything, she whispered. You stopped wanting more. No, I said quietly. I stopped needing strangers to tell me I mattered. Claire's expression broke slightly after that. Not dramatically, just enough for me to see the woman underneath all the polished layers again. The woman who once loved me before status became part of the conversation. I do not know when I became this person, she admitted softly. I believed her. That was the tragedy of it. Most people do not notice themselves changing while it happens. They just wake up one day sitting across from someone they love, realizing respect quietly left the room years earlier. I set the bourbon glass down beside the fireplace and stood slowly. Claire watched me immediately. Where are you going? I grabbed my coat from the back of the leather chair near the door. Home. Ethan? Her voice cracked slightly on my name. First time all night. Please do not leave like this. I looked at her for a long second beneath the soft firelight. Beautiful woman. Expensive house. Rain against old glass. 10 years of marriage sitting silently between us like smoke after a fire finally burns out. Claire, I said quietly. I think I've been gone for a long time already. Tears gathered in her eyes then, but she never let them fall. Maybe pride still stood in the way. Maybe shock. Maybe both. I walked past her toward the library door, pausing only once with my hand against the brass handle. Behind me, her voice came softer than I had heard it in years. I did love you. I closed my eyes briefly before answering. I know. Then I stepped out into the cold Connecticut night, while rain drifted softly across the estate lights, and somewhere behind me, the house stood silent at last. And as I walked toward my car beneath the dark November sky, I realized something strange. Losing the respect of strangers never truly breaks a man. But losing the respect of the person who once knew your soul by heart? That kind of silence echoes for years.
Thank you for watching until the end. Watch the full story in the comments and video description. Like and subscribe to the channel to see more interesting content.